Hello, everyone. My name is Laurie Anderson, and I'm the Executive Director of SFU's Vancouver campus. And I'm speaking to you today from the unceded ancestral lands of the peoples of the Coast Salish, the Squamish, the Musqueam, and the Tsleil-Waututh. I'd like to thank you for joining us today for this very special presentation of Richard Wilkinson on inequality, pandemics, and climate change. And this is part of our SFU Vancouver Speaker Series. To start our conversation off in the right way, I would like to pass the virtual microphone over to Elder Dennis Joseph from the Squamish Nation. Elder Joseph's ancestral name is Kay-Quich Tall. Elder Joseph, over to you.
Osiam Hoichuk, Tumakutsi Kutsnachum, Hoats and Stomo, Siam, and Hot Hamalchison, Tisha Ochumeo, Tumakutsi Kutsnachum, Stomo. My hands are up to you, Laurie, for your kind introduction. On behalf of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, I offer warm welcome, especially on behalf of our elders, our children, our matriarchs, and our patriarchs. I'm grateful and thankful to offer this warm welcome from the bottom of my heart to each and every one of you as we Lotsamat, as we say in our language, gathered together with one heart and one mind. A special blessing for Richard, for you, for the work that you are doing and will be doing to help us move forward in the most humane way possible. The song I want to share with you comes from me, Kuchto. It's called Anina. Over the last 600 days plus, we've all fallen one way or another with this pandemic. And I heard that word growing up. It's a Squamish word, and as a toddler I heard it, and as a young man I heard it. And when I asked my mom what it meant, she said, well, we all fall in our life. And she said, it's up to you to get up. But every once in a while you need help. And this word is to keep your soul, your spirit together. I share this with you, and there's also words near that will be for Tisha Ochumeo, our Mother Earth, Chesiam, our Creator, Muntmun, our children. You'll hear these words in this song. So it's not only a blessing for you, Richard, but all those that are watching here, that we continue to work together with one heart, one mind, go one heart, Anina. 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 OCM, giving thanks to Creator, Mother Earth, and all that she provides for all our children, for our Skakastomok, those who have left before us. We're grateful and thankful for the life and love left in us. OCM, blessings to each and every one of you. Waichakyo. OCM, thank you.
Thank you, Elder Joseph K. Quichtal. Thank you for getting us started in the right way. We appreciate you spending time with us today. For those of you who've just joined us, my name is Laurie Anderson, the Executive Director of SFU's Vancouver campus. It is my honor to welcome you to the SFU Vancouver Speaker Series featuring Richard Wilkinson. This Vancouver Speaker Series was launched in 2012 initially to bring global experts to the Vancouver audience. And through being online now, we can expand that audience far wider, of course, than locally. It builds on SFU's rich history of community engagement. And we have brought in the past, such eminent thinkers as Naomi Klein, Chris Hedges, Wynne Dyer, Milun Katari, Amitav Ghosh, and Shabama Azmi to explore critical issues with people in the Vancouver region. SFU is very proud to be offering the SFU Vancouver Speaker Series with our colleagues and friends at SFU Public Square and at SFU's Van City Office of Community Engagement. I'd like to go over just a few quick housekeeping points before I introduce you to our moderator. We do have closed captioning available today, and you can turn it off and on by clicking the CC button on the black bar at the bottom of your screen and then clicking View Subtitle. We're also pleased to have ASL English interpretation available. If you would like to revisit today's presentation in the future, you can do so either visiting SFU Public Square's YouTube channel, but also we will be sending a link to each of you in the follow-up email. If you run into any technical difficulties, you can send a message on the chat to hosts and panelists, and we will help out by reaching out to you. And lastly, in the housekeeping area, I'd like to draw your attention to our community guidelines, which you will find in the chat and on screen now. We ask that everyone respect these guidelines so we can have a safe, honest, and socially accountable dialogue together today. And please, of course, if you need to step away at any time for any reason, please feel free to do so. It is now my pleasure to introduce you to our moderator for today's event, Laura Lynch. Laura is an award-winning journalist at CBC and the host of What on Earth on CBC Radio, which won this year's Canadian Journalism Foundation Award for Climate Solutions Reporting. In the course of Laura's career, she has reported from across Canada and around the world. And Laura has won the prestigious Nieman Fellowship from Harvard University, and also awards from the British Bar Association, the Canadian Bar Association, the Overseas Club of America, and Amnesty International. It's a pleasure to welcome Laura as our moderator today. Over to you, Laura.
Thank you very much, Laurie, and I hope you can all hear me, if not see me. We were having some technical difficulties before. It is my pleasure, though, to be here this afternoon, as we said, joining you from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. We have all seen how this pandemic has exposed and worsened inequality in Canada and around the world. At the same time, our climate crisis has become impossible to ignore, with a summer of deadly heat waves, wildfires, and droughts, and more recently, the bomb cyclone, which has never happened before off the west coast of BC. To help us think through these crises and to argue that greater economic equality is fundamental to addressing them, I'm pleased to introduce Richard Wilkinson. For decades, Mr. Wilkinson has played a formative role in international research on the social determinants of health and on the societal effects of income inequality. He studied economic history at the London School of Economics before training in epidemiology. He is a professor emeritus of social epidemiology at the University of Nottingham Medical School honorary professor at University College London, and visiting professor at the University of York. Richard is also the co-author with Kate Pickett of the award-winning and best-selling book, The Spirit Level, which put inequality at the center of public debate by showing conclusively that less equal societies fare worse than more equal ones across everything from education to life expectancy. In their follow-up book, The Inner Level, Wilson and Pickett described how inequality affects us individually, altering how we think, feel, and behave. Wilkinson is also the co-founder of the Equality Trust, that is with the support from the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust, which seeks to promote public understanding of the effects of inequality. And if you want to see a full biography, you can please look at the chat. I'd like to note that following Richard Wilkinson's presentation, we'll hear short responses from Chuka Ejekam, a political researcher and writer, and Maya Gislason, an assistant professor in SFU's Faculty of Health Sciences. Then I will lead us all in a conversation, taking in questions from the audience, which you can pose in the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen at any time. Now, without further ado, Richard Wilkinson.
Thank you very much, Laura. I'd like to start by thanking Elder Dennis Joseph for his very warm welcome. I was glad to hear it and moved by the song. I'm not going to talk very much about COVID, except to say that there are now at least 6 different peer-reviewed papers showing that its effects have been less serious in more equal societies, fewer deaths, fewer cases, and so on. It's really quite a pronounced effect, and it's very much what we expected, typical of many other, not only of the great infections, but the degenerative diseases as well have that same pattern. I'm going to talk, though, primarily about the environmental crisis and how inequality can help us through it. My first book was Poverty in Progress, and it was subtitled An Ecological Model of Economic Development, published as long ago as 1973. Alongside my work on inequality, that means I have, at least in the background, now been following environmental issues for almost 50 years. And I have reluctantly come to the belief that modern attitudes to the climate crisis reflect a mixture of a dangerous myopia and a pretty desperate desire to maintain an optimistic view, almost regardless of the truth. And I think we've been lulled into a false sense of security by that. Of course, we should try, but we'll probably fail to make the huge reductions in our levels of consumption, as well as dramatic changes in our way of life. The changes which have to be made are almost certainly much bigger than the transition to the war economy made at the beginning of the Second World War. Our chances of making the necessary transition are not only very seriously obstructed by the prevailing myopia and false optimism, but also by the popular view that 1.5 or 2 degrees warming is acceptable. I think that's given us a sense that somehow it's all right and there's more time to go, we've got a bit more room. But the last summer in the Northern Hemisphere, the fires, the heat waves, the floods show really the results of a 1.1 rise in temperature. And 1.5 is a lot worse than that, 2 degrees worse than that. And I think actually, as we see the preparations for COP26, it looks quite a lot worse than that. I remember some speeches, great speeches that the Guardian newspaper reprinted many years ago. It included one of Churchill's speeches made in June 1940 after the withdrawal of Dunkirk. You may know at least of it. It's the one where he talks about we shall fight them on the beaches, fight them on the landing grounds, fight them in the fields, so on. A modern commentary on that speech noted that Churchill's only rhetorical device was to tell the truth. He didn't shrink from referring to the withdrawal from Dunkirk as the greatest military disaster in our long history. He called it a colossal military disaster. And he didn't avoid mentioning the loss of Belgium, the Belgian army, the weakening of French forces, the loss of industrial capacity. But at the same time, he kindled a spirit of resolve and resistance, though this was not the speech 3 weeks earlier in which he had said he could offer nothing but blood, toil, sweat, and tears. I think we are in a situation that requires the same honesty. I think we're really on the edge of a precipice. We're just about to start the climate change conference in Glasgow, COP26. And I believe our situation in relation to climate change is dire. I'm going to explain why I think it's so dire, and then go on to explain the necessity, if we're going to minimize the damage, of very major reductions in inequality. Let me just try and see if I can share my screen. I'm going to be changing to and fro. Yes. So can you all see that screen now?
Not right now, Richard.
Not. Share. Okay. Have I done it right now?
Now we can see it. Thank you.
Good. So this shows the rise in carbon, the carbon dioxide burden in the atmosphere rising since the beginning of industrialization. My first subject, my first degree was economic history, and so I studied that process. And you see the enormous rise since, particularly since 1950. And if we look at the next graph here, you can see here that more than half of the carbon in the atmosphere, more than half the emissions, human emissions since 1750, have come since 1990. That is an indication of the enormous scale at which we're tipping this into the atmosphere, and how recent it's been such an extraordinarily serious problem. This graph shows the different models of how we might reach 1.5 degrees, keep warming to below 1.5 degrees. And you see the solid black line rising is what's actually been happening to carbon emissions. That little dog leg in blue is the pandemic, but I'm afraid we're now back on track, continuing that upward trend of the black line. To solve this problem, we would have to move down where those gray lines are going, reducing our carbon emissions at that rate. Those are the different models that different climate scientists have projected on basis of different assumptions. And most of them, nearly all of them, actually depend on taking carbon out of the atmosphere on a massive scale, which has only been done on a semi-experimental basis. Nothing on the scale, the extraordinary scale it would have to be done to make a real difference. But I think most of us looking at that graph and knowing world politicians and the jockeying that goes on between them, don't expect suddenly to get from COP26 in Glasgow to that downward track as fast as that. Now, I'm going to stop sharing for a moment. So, one of the great scientists involved in these issues is Canadian, William Reese at the University of Vancouver. A paper he did with Megan Siebert very recently gave us an indication what would have to happen for the USA to transition to renewable electricity. 81% of the US's energy at the moment comes from fossil fuels. If we're to change that to 90% of it coming from decarbonized electrification, renewable electricity by 2035, we would have to erect every year for the next 15 years 4 times as many wind turbines and 3 times as many solar panels as the US did in 2019, and then replace the whole stock every 15 to 30 years indefinitely as they wear out. Even building an adequate US electricity grid for this by 2050 would mean replacing and extending the grid 14 times as fast over the past half century. And it was estimated 10 years ago that installing a global solar program would cost roughly $252 trillion. So I wanted to take you through that just to show the scale of the task in front of us. And of course, it isn't simply CO2. That's not the only problem. We've overshot the planet's carrying capacity in many other dimensions. During industrialization, world population has increased about 8-fold, and per capita income about 15-fold. So giving perhaps 120-fold increase in world GNP. So that's what we're imposing on the environment. Large-scale industrial production means we're using somewhere around 1.6 or 1.75 planets. And that means we're eating into natural stocks of forests, water, soils, fish, pollution, plastics, species loss, ocean acidification. It's not just CO2 in the atmosphere we have to deal with. And the production of the renewable energy technologies is itself, from mining to installation, fossil energy intensive and entails significant ecological degradation. So it's the whole burden of our industrial system, the world industrial system, that we're going to have to deal with. At the same time, carbon sinks are failing. The ways in which the natural environment absorbed some of the carbon, about half the carbon that we emitted into the atmosphere, is taken up in the sea in other ways. A study published in April this year found that the Amazon rainforest is no longer soaking up CO2. You'd have thought with all those trees it would be absorbing the carbon dioxide, but it's become a net emitter of carbon dioxide. Just to take another single example, the soils simply in the UK are estimated to be losing 13 million tons of carbon a year, equal to the annual reduction in carbon dioxide carbon dioxide emissions achieved by the UK under the Kyoto Treaty. That's about 12, 13 million tons of carbon per year. So just our soils are emitting carbon now that offsets the little we did after Kyoto. On top of that, there are feedback effects of global warming. The Arctic has become a net source of greenhouse gases, and melting permafrost now emits huge quantities of the main greenhouse gases, methane, carbon dioxide, and nitrous oxide. And the permafrost is melting. Permafrost temperatures have increased by up to 4 degrees between 1990 and 2016. And greenhouse gas emissions from the Arctic permafrost are currently almost equal to the total emissions from Russia or Japan. So the feedback effects are really enormous. And there are suggestions that actually previous great extinctions may have been triggered by sudden eruptions of methane. The so-called methane ice, methane clathrate or methane hydrate, as ice covers the shallow Arctic seas, as it melts, the sun then penetrates deeper into the sea, and in the shallow seas, it melts the methane ice on the bottom of the sea. In 2008, methane levels in the Siberian Arctic were detected up to 100 times normal, probably from thawing the methane ice. And it suggested that an important contributor to mass extinctions may have been runaway warming. Methane, of course, is much more powerful greenhouse gas than CO2, but it's fortunately doesn't stay in the atmosphere nearly as long, perhaps not much more than 12 years. There is the loss of reflective snow and ice. You know, ice on the sea reflects 60 or 70% of solar energy. But the open sea, once it's melted, reflects only 6%. And Arctic sea ice cover has shrunk by 40% since 1979, and there may soon be ice-free months. I don't think I'll spend time reminding you about the wildfires. They're too fresh in all our memories. One good thing is, of course, that in some cases, forest regrowth reabsorbs the carbon they release. But wildfires in the Amazon, which are much bigger, are much less likely to be lead to regrowth of forest and reabsorption of that carbon. So what does the future hold for us? Obviously, we can no longer hold the comforting idea that sustainability is simply a matter of switching to a new energy system and continuing our high-impact lifestyles into the future. Business as usual is out. It's impossible in the long run. Instead, our long-term objective has to be to create a new world without fossil fuels and within the planet's carrying capacity, in part like the pre-industrial world, but with the benefits of modern science, but crucially also with many, many more people. At the same time, that world will have to cope with much more frequent, intense fires, floods, storms, droughts, heat waves, rising sea levels, additional conflicts over access to water, land, food, and other resources, and vastly increased flows of refugees, causing even worse political reactions than we've seen already. And I think you can see what an enormous impact flows of refugees and prejudice and so on has had in politics in many of our countries. A recent paper by Peter Barnard and various other climate scientists published, I think it's maybe still in press, in Science Progress, and signed by 25,000 scientists. Its last paragraph I'd like to read you. They say, over the next decade, we have a stark choice: to demonstrate the very best of our natures as Homo sapiens, cooperative, innovative, wise and ethical, to learn from mistakes and create better societies, or to go down with both a bang of conflict and a whimper of bickering, entitlement and self-interest. That choice is ours. The actions or inactions of individual leaders in government, communities and businesses in this decade will be remembered darkly, or hopefully kindly. Everything we know and love is at stake. And that is, as I say, a paper by climate scientists signed by 25,000 other scientists. I believe that what matters most to the future of humanity is whether we cooperate and help each other out or fight for our own self-interest. We depend on a strong ethos of mutual support and reciprocity. The most likely long-term outcome is probably more conflict, people fending for themselves and guarding whatever they have against others. Our best hope is, I believe, much greater equality. And I want to show you why. I'm going to share my screen again. Sorry. Are you seeing that now?
Yes, we are, Richard.
I want to show you just very quickly the very strong evidence that greater equality makes a better society, more public-spirited, people more cooperative, more willing to help each other. This shows people's participation in local groups and voluntary organizations is greater in more equal societies. This is a scatter of different rich developed countries showing much higher levels of participation in local community life in more equal societies. The same sort of data you can get from the 50 states of the United States, showing they too are much more cooperative if they have smaller income differences between rich and poor. You can also see that people trust each other more where there's greater equality. So along the bottom, you again have income inequality, and up the side, you have the proportion of the population who agree most people can be trusted. And you see very big differences in the proportion. This is the American states who feel they can trust others. There's slightly bigger differences internationally in relation to measures of interpersonal trust. There are also now research papers which show that people in more equal countries are more willing to help each other, to help the elderly or people with disabilities and so on. Those societies are more cooperative. But if you look at yes, this is the equivalent of that American graph for countries, and you see in the more unequal countries, only 15 or 20% of the population agree that most people can be trusted, whereas it's 60 or 70% in the more equal countries. The experiments to see that psychologists have done to see whether lost wallets are returned show enormous differences in how cooperative and helpful people are in more equal and unequal societies. So again, along the bottom, inequality, the more unequal countries, perhaps only 20% of the wallets are returned to their owners, lost wallets returned, whereas in more equal countries, perhaps 80%. Huge differences. Huge differences in the public ethos of those societies. There are a great many studies looking at homicide rates as a measure of violence in different places all over the world. And this is fairly typical. The red dots are American states, the blue triangles are Canadian provinces. And you see here, amongst the Canadian provinces, homicides when this graph was drawn were about 15 homicides per million population, whereas in some of the more unequal American states, it's 10 times that level. Those huge differences. There now must be perhaps 60 studies showing these sorts of patterns, these relationships between violence and inequality. The first studies of this kind were published in the 1970s, and they still haven't got into the understanding of our politicians. But if you look at really much more unequal countries than these rich developed countries, more unequal than Britain or the United States, and much more unequal than Canada, you go to places like Mexico, you see it's all gone a stage further. Here you see people are barricading their houses, bars on the windows and doors, these big fences with razor wires around the top. And you see just the same sort of thing in South Africa, where there's huge inequality for quite different reasons. Those parallel lines, horizontal lines, are of course an electric fence. And the notice warns you that if you're caught climbing in, there will be an armed response. You might get shot. So what we're seeing is this breakdown of trust, reciprocity, helpfulness, public spirited in the most equal societies, being replaced gradually by a loss of trust, a loss of community life, and then people being actually frightened of each other, as in these last two pictures. It's an awful change. It goes right to the heart of our social relations, our willingness to help each other, our feelings towards each other. And actually, this picture I've just been giving you the last few slides is confirmed by quite different data. This is data from two American economists. This is an international study they did, but it's also, they've shown it for American states. They looked at the proportion of the labor force in each country involved in what they called guard labor. Guard labor are security staff, police, prison officers, people like that. They are, in effect, all the occupations we use to protect ourselves from each other. And as inequality increases, a higher proportion of the population is in guard labor. So it confirms very much that picture I showed you of the decline in, well, the growth of antisocial societies, if you like, with greater inequality. I think it's a mistake to think this is just something funny about income inequality itself. We've shown in both our books that basically all the problems that have social gradients, all the problems that are worse at the bottom of society, get worse throughout society with more inequality. Now, you all know that people in the poorest areas have the worst health, the poorest educational performance, usually the highest levels of violence. What we're dealing with is whether we have a society, a social pyramid that is a steep one, this shape, or a much shallower one, like that. Basically, what inequality does is it makes issues of superiority and inferiority more important. It makes class and status more important. It leads, for instance, to fewer people marrying people from other class backgrounds. The whole society becomes more ossified. Social mobility declines. There's now good data showing that. And I've shown you that community life weakens. And what happens is that with class and status becoming more important, we all become more worried about how we are seen and judged by others. Along the bottom in this graph, you have the income deciles, the poorest tenth of the population on the left, and the richest tenth of the population on the right. And that top line is the levels of status anxiety, people's worries about how they are seen and judged in more unequal countries. The bottom line shows people worry less about how they're seen and judged. And of course, those insecurities about how you're viewed, what others think of you, lead, amongst other things, to more consumerism. One way we try and show our self-worth to others is by buying a flashier car, more expensive car, or clothes with the right designer labels and things like that. All the things we hope will show us off in a good light. And of course, consumerism is one of the major obstacles to moving towards sustainability. Why inequality has these very powerful effects became clear really as we were trying to understand health inequalities in different societies. Rather to our surprise, when I say ours, I mean researchers around the world looking at social determinants of health, we saw that it wasn't simply differences in material standards that damaged health. It was actually social status itself, lower social status, quite apart from living standards, is damaging to health. Feeling inferior, feeling looked down on, worrying about how you're seen and judged is a really powerful form of chronic stress, affecting, well, chronic stress leads to what looks rather like more rapid aging. Whereas friendship is almost the opposite of that. Friendship is based on reciprocity, on mutuality, on social obligations, on sharing, and a recognition of each other's needs. So basically, those are the two different ways human beings can come together. Either we compete for resources and the strongest takes the lion's share, or we recognize each other's needs. And those have been two fundamental determinants of health because they are important sources of chronic stress, or the opposite, of confidence, a feeling of mutual support. So whether it's a matter of food and shelter, sexual partners, clothing, or jobs, we have the potential to be each other's most awesome rivals. But we also have the potential to be each other's greatest source of support, affection, assistance, learning, and love. And the nature of social relations has therefore always been crucial to our psychological and material well-being. And indeed, through 90% of our existence as anatomically modern human beings with brains the current size, we lived in surprisingly egalitarian societies in which they were based on food sharing and gift exchange. And indeed, we see the imprint of these things still in our societies. Words like companion combine com meaning with and pan meaning bread. Your companions are the people you share the necessities of life with. And Marshall Sahlins, a wonderful American anthropologist who studied those hunting and gathering societies throughout his career, said, gifts make friends and friends make gifts. The gift is the symbol that we don't compete over access to material necessities. And so inequality shows us the extent to which what we share with others, or whether it's everyone for themselves. Let me try now to stop sharing. So I want to say something about how greater equality has been used before to aid these huge transitions that we have to make now. Richard Titmuss, who was the father of social policy and official historian of social policy during the Second World War in Britain, described how the government realized that to gain public participation in the war effort, it had to make people feel that the burden of war was fairly shared. He described how, he said, if the cooperation of the masses was thought to be essential to the war effort, then inequalities had to be reduced, and the pyramid of social stratification had to be flattened. As a result, the war was marked by far-reaching policies designed to make people feel the burden of war was fairly shared. Income differences were rapidly reduced by taxation, essential goods were subsidized, luxuries were taxed, and rationing was introduced for food. Action on the climate emergency now needs a similar raft of egalitarian policies. We need similar increases in equality to gain support for the action against climate change that we so desperately need. In France, President Macron tried to bring in raised fuel duties, raised fuel taxes. But even while it was just a proposal, there was a massive uprising of the Gilets jaunes movement all over France that went on for month after month in endless different cities, opposing that policy on grounds that it was unfair. And it led to general criticisms of the whole tax system as unfair. If we're going to really make an impact on climate change and not end up with the bickering and opposition to anything governments try and do about it, governments have to show us that this is fairly shared and gain our support in the effort where we all have to pull together. They have to create that feeling. I'm once more going to, for the last time, share. Okay, I want to finish just by showing how more equal countries already do better on things to do with climate change. There was a survey of business leaders' opinions on issues to do with environmental regulation. And business leaders were much more supportive in the low inequality countries on the left than they were in the more unequal countries, where I think businesses felt their job was to look after their own business, and it was government's job to worry about the rest. Really quite big differences. in that sense of responsibility amongst the business community. You can look at the kilograms of carbon emissions per $100 of income, and you see that it's higher in the more unequal countries. You can look at the amount of recycling, how much different countries recycle their waste, metals and plastics, glass, paper, and so on. Recycling is much more of the materials are recycled in more equal countries. So, to create a more sustainable society, it's no longer a matter of little changes in policy, of trying to drive less. It's much more fundamental. Individuals or household carbon ration cards are needed. So whenever we buy something, it takes something off our carbon ration. We need perhaps a one-child policy if we're really going to be able to move towards a society which is sustainable. We won't be there for quite a long time. We need to do things like ending advertising. And actually, we have to envisage a world without fossil fuels, which you might think would look like pre-industrial societies, but with the benefits of modern science. Universal insurance against climate risks will be necessary. You know, if we're all much more prone to climate onslaughts of the different kinds, not only that, but also food price rises, energy price rises, huge fluctuations that we're in for. We need forms of economic democracy to deal with the income differences. The main reason our income inequalities have grown is the runaway incomes at the top, the CEOs. The income differences within the biggest companies are 10 times as big as they used to be. Maybe we need to set some threshold level of inequality in companies, a 1 to 12 income policy perhaps, that nobody should be able to earn in a month what it takes other people a whole year to earn. And of course, we need tax reform. We need to deal with tax havens and tax avoidance. But as life gets more difficult physically, perhaps we can ensure that it gets better socially, more reciprocity, more mutual support. And that is actually probably the most important influence on well-being. Well-being is fundamentally in the studies a matter of the quality of social relations, the quality of your relationships, whether you're involved in community life, whether you have friends, things of that kind. And so by reducing inequality, we can make our lives better in that way and better able to withstand the onslaughts we face from climate change. Thank you.
Richard Wilkinson, thank you so much. That was a comprehensive, incredibly thought-provoking and sobering talk in which you also included some solutions that I think might sound quite radical to some people, but may be the right thing for the right time. I just want to make sure that our audience knows that if you do have any questions for Richard Wilkinson or Dr. Gustafson or Chuka, who are about to speak, make sure you use the Q&A function. It can be accessed at the bottom of the screen below your video. Now, we have two people to respond to to Richard Wilkinson's remarks. Sorry, I spent a lot of time talking to Jonathan Wilkinson, who was our climate change minister. Chuka, however, is a political researcher and writer and a research associate with the BC office of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. He holds a master's degree in political science from the University of British Columbia. He also serves on the steering and advisory committee of the SFU Labor Studies program, and he served on the organizing committee for a UBC Lind Initiative Speaker Series. Chuka.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you, Richard, for that presentation. I mean, yeah, there was a great amount in it that I would want to respond to or discuss at length. But one thing in particular was you mentioned that as was evidenced by the discussion in national mobilization for the war effort in the middle of the 20th century, you mentioned that it's essential for these burdens to be fairly shared, or at very least to be perceived to be fairly shared, to help encourage public support and buy-in and participation in these sort of transformative programs. And I don't take issue with that. My question is, what would you say, or what do you feel the degree to which this perception could be established? I am, so it's I don't know, for example, that you mentioned again how an increase in refugees would correspond with an increase in sort of xenophobia, explicit ethno-nationalism, and rejection of refugees and whatnot in many of the industrialized liberal democracies in the self-styled West. And certainly that's the case. But in that regard, how then can you attempt to establish that principle of fairly shared burdens in a grievously unfair world in which the interests or quarters or nations which have benefited from the past 5 centuries of entrenched and evolving inequity or have the most to fear from their own, the most to fear internally from attempting to respond to those things equitably. So for example, in the UK or in the US, while of course political leaders don't always and perhaps never care for every individual in the country, there at least is the ostensible responsibility to provide for them being citizens of the jurisdiction that one is governing. However, I don't think there's even the appearance of a global responsibility in that regard. So through what arguments or through what measures could countries like the UK, and the US and Canada and multilateral organizations such as the EU be compelled to genuinely expend their wealth to benefit others? In a perhaps is a somewhat trite way to express it, but it seems to me that the necessary position in those countries, in those jurisdictions, is that the political systems, the public, the governments have to be willing to reduce the aggregate well-being of people within their own country or within their own jurisdiction to increase the aggregate well-being of people outside of their country or jurisdiction. And it seems to me to be a hard sell. Obviously, it's incredibly important, but that I think is the concern that I have. And I don't think that concern should forestall action. I only mean that I guess I'm wary that you could achieve, or I'm skeptical that you could achieve that collaboration. For example, is it not the case that there are some organizations or individuals who there's no cause to collaborate with? Organizations like ExxonMobil, or individuals like Jeffrey Bezos and Elon Musk and Bill Gates. These people organizations and people who I would contend have no interest in the well-being of the world, who offer nothing to the planet, and their existence is only detrimental to the well-being of everyone else. Is it possible that the kind of collaboration that you discussed could be collaborative opposition against some of these interests, organizations, or people who, in my estimation, simply will not relinquish what they've stolen from the rest of the world and are actively stealing from us, and the latter being the possibility of a future of meaningful lives lived by all. And I'm not certain how much more time I have, so please feel free to cut me off. But the last thing I think that I would mention is, my great fear, and I've mentioned this frequently, but my great fear is that the wealthy countries of the world will, as circumstances get increasingly desperate, the wealthy countries of the world will simply build walls with gun turrets along the top and leave everybody else in the world to suffer and die, or whatever else happens, but ultimately sort of wash their hands of humanity. And I don't know that I don't see reason to believe that they would act any differently. And if that's the case, again, skeptical that collaboration is likely to bring them along. That said, these are particular perceptions, and I'm speaking, it's, part of this comes from the fact that it's difficult for me to believe that Canada or the US or the EU would accept tens of millions of African refugees, for example. I very much doubt that. And I think the great amounts of horror that we've seen in the Mediterranean are already evidencing this. And as well as the US policy to Haitian refugees at the southern border, it's not only that there are these extremely inhumane policies being implemented, but the policies also absolutely ignore the past 500 years of history, the fact that it was European notions of land use and ownership, of wage labor, of individual enrichment, and exclusively negative rights that got us to this point, that got us to a world in which it seems easy to wash your hands of the responsibility of others' well-being, to think that as long as you're okay, then nothing else matters. So yeah, those would be the aspects that I would identify. But overall, incredibly grateful for the presentation and for this opportunity to engage with you and Maya. Thank you.
Chuka, thank you for those remarks that really, I'm sure, will provoke more discussion. Let's now turn to Dr. Gislason. She's a Michael Smith Foundation for Health Research Scholar and Assistant Professor in the Faculty of Health Sciences at Simon Fraser University, and the founder of the Research, Ecosocial and Equitable Transformation, acronym RESET, team. As an eco-social equity scholar, she works with a range of partners on projects rooted in the ethic of intergenerational climate justice and towards the goal of improving health for young people and the planet. Over to you.
Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here. Thank you to Elder Dennis Joseph and Richard Wilkinson for your thoughtful and provocative ideas, and also to the SFU Vancouver Speaker Series. I would like to, thank you, Richard, very much for having us think about what it looks like to get real, and also Chuka, you for adding and extending those thoughts, to listen to the science, and to really take time to comprehend the complexity, the seriousness, the urgency of the issues that we're dealing with. And so one of the questions that I sit with a lot is where to from here? So what do we do? And I think partly what happens is that it depends on the perspective that we ask that question from. And as Laura said, I work a lot with children and youth. And I am very much committed to trying to understand these issues from their perspective. And what I see in my work as young people try and find hope and well-being in this issue as they gaze into their futures is sort of a choice point between descending into despair and despondency, and we see suicide rates emerging and so on because of climate anxiety. Or do we help young people face a future with, and do we help them find ways into action? And as older generations, how do we position ourselves as taking action and walking alongside youth? And so I think what we call grounded hope in our work is this idea that we tell the truth to ourselves and one another. We ground in science, and I think young people are very grounded in science. We just have the Youth for Climate event having just happened in Italy in pre-COP 26, where we have young people calling out against the politics of blah, 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 and calling for action and asking us to advance into this with ambition, with love, as you were describing, and with a commitment to doing things differently. And so I think here is hope, here is well-being. And what I also see when we're trying to deal with the intractability and insurmountability of the issues is that these young people are beyond stuck governments and stuck political systems. They're creating other channels of action. They're raising their voices outside of the political and the social and the economic systems that chronically exclude them and silence them and marginalize them. And I think that there's a lesson here for us about what do we do? We move outside and beyond and around. We move into communities, we move into collective action and so on to try and create new ways of facing these issues. I think another perspective that I take so much instruction from is the work of our global experts in relationship-based and planetary-based thinking, and that are Indigenous peoples who know how to think in these ways and are offering to us governance structures, principles, practices, medicine, and a sense of who we are as selves, as planetary beings, and that is a profound opportunity for us to not only move beyond our colonial systems, but move into relationship-based action. And I think then, it also helps us really ground in the idea of intergenerational justice as a reframing of how we need to tackle these issues, to bring what you talked about in terms of really rethinking what are the thoughts, what are our priorities, what are our practices. And I think that that's something else. And so I really appreciate what you've said, your wake-up call. And I wonder what your thoughts are about not being in terms of or uninformed in terms of our hopefulness, but actually be grounded in science, and then try beyond the pathways that are impeding us to bringing the visions for change that young people are seeing in our future as a possibility. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maya, Dr. Gislason. One more time, I'm just going to remind everyone that if you have questions to use the Q&A function, but because I'm moderating, I get to ask the first question. So, your talk, Richard Wilkinson, is very timely. I mean, it is always timely, but particularly so, I think, because just this week, we have been diving a bit more deeply into what's coming up at COP26 in terms of the promises that have been made to less wealthy countries by wealthy developed countries to give them money to help them deal with both mitigation and adaptation when it comes to climate change. Those promises were first made in 2009, $100 billion, which is a figure that was pulled out of thin air, renewed again in 2015 and promised to be delivered by 2020. And we know as of this week that didn't happen. It was a broken promise. And now there are more promises coming to increase that amount of money again. At the same time, the figures that are realistic figures that are shown to be needed is in the area of $4 trillion, perhaps more, for these nations that have suffered a lot from climate change that wasn't created by them. It was created by more developed countries. So Dr. Wilkinson, I am wondering when you talk about what kind of sharing you would like to see, what kind of political leadership you would like to see, when you see what has happened on that front, what do you think?
Well, all your comments are very useful and provocative, but I suppose the importance of facing the truth is that we then start discussing the reality of the predicament we're in. With the Paris, the targets that countries made for themselves voluntarily, they weren't going to be enough to keep temperatures down anywhere near 1.5 or 2 degrees. They were asked for this COP26 to revise them. Those revisions, if countries kept to them, are estimated to perhaps allow us to keep temperatures down to a rise of 2.7 degrees. but we know they're not going to keep to them. And so I think we're in for a minimum of 3 degrees. That 2.7 degrees, if they keep to them, is the IPCC figure. But when Chuka envisages the response, the gun turrets and washing the hands of humanity and so on, I think he's very likely right. But you see, the problem is that we have lulled ourselves into this myopia, this false sense of security. I've been part of that too, thinking that if you can make people optimistic about a better society, sustainable society, we're more likely to make the changes. But actually, we've talked about carbon budgets, and we've suggested that 1.5 degrees is all right, and we've still got some way to go. It all is a false sense of security. And I don't have answers to the problems you're raising, you're rightly raising, but we can't even discuss them unless we're facing the truth. And I think that that is really what I wanted to do. And of course, there's lots of evidence of young people becoming a sort of eco-depression and so on, thinking about the future. But the despair is partly because of the inactivity, the lack of activity on behalf of governments, knowing that we're not going to get there. And actually, if we had a cooperative, urgent activity, purposeful activity, if we did feel we were all pulling together to make the changes that had to be made, I think that that would be quite invigorating, despite the fact that we wouldn't be able to, by any means, solve all the problems. There are already additional wars over access to water and so on, and there are undoubtedly going to be more of that. And I believe something like 90% of the loss of lives due to climate change is in poorer countries. You know, Chuka's right to emphasize that side of things. But, you know, there's no point in thinking or talking about this unless we face the reality. And this is the reality. If you read the stuff, I've spent several weeks reading around this on top of what I knew before preparing for this. And of course, worried that I might be making a mistake, misunderstanding things, having my own pessimism. But I really don't think that's it at all. I think that is what the science is telling us. And there are now papers from IPCC, from Greta Thunberg, from these reports signed by thousands of scientists. We just have to make the politicians pay attention. We have to rise up if they don't. There's nothing else we can do.
Can I just jump in there, because I want to turn to a question from our audience that just seems to be begging for more of a response for you on that point. This is a question from Tim. We had put our faith in government leaders to protect us and the planet. For decades, misinformation and denial hid the urgent nature of the problem. Today, our leaders continue to make promises on emissions reductions, just as they have in the past. Our political system is largely controlled by moneyed elites with financial interests in fossil energy. So electoral change is too slow, even if it is possible. What is an effective response of civil society to the present climate emergency?
I've spent most of the time, my time campaigning on inequality and thinking about how to deal with that. And I do think the answer is greater economic democracy, employee representatives on the boards. I think we need a near revolution in control of industry in the name of greater democracy. I think that a lot of what is powering the growing worsening of our situation is, of course, the vested interests of big business. I think that we have to be demonstrating outside, or preferably inside, the big oil companies. We are headed for the road to disaster, and there isn't an easy turnaround, but we have to face it and do whatever we can when we get opportunities. And if suddenly, uprisings often come about when they're least expected. Now, I remember the Paris uprisings in 1968, when de Gaulle fled from Paris, thinking that there was another French Revolution coming, strikes of workers and students together. It was a period of prosperity, quite unexpected. And again, you get these changes in a totally unpredictable way. Chris Hedges, whose lectures you may have heard online, talks about how a number of upheavals, major changes have been produced when people have done not what they think is calculated through some set of strategies to work. They've done what they can when they felt there was nothing else they could do. And people have, and one of the examples he gave was the person, the market stall holder, I think in Egypt, who burnt himself to death, and that started a huge uprising. But there are all sorts of examples of people just doing the only thing they can do, not based on careful strategy.
Right.
And I think perhaps we need to take heed of that kind of way of thinking and realize that change can sometimes come when it's least expected. You can suddenly, people will get the picture and generate major change. I'm not sounding convincingly helpful and optimistic, because that's not our situation.
Well, it's interesting you say those things coming off a federal election that just happened. I just want to make sure people understand we're getting close to the end of time, but I want to keep going with another audience question, and I'd like both Chuka and Maya to weigh in on this as well. This is from Doug. How would you rationalize to Canadians that such a small country like Canada, in terms of its total net contribution of global gashouse emissions in comparison to the rest of the world, especially USA, China, India, to drastically change our economic structure to mitigate greenhouse gases? It would lead to internal economic hardships within Canada, yet have a negligible positive impact on global human greenhouse gases. This paradigm is a difficult one to accept by our citizens. Why would we do this? Mr. Wilkinson.
Well, actually, if you look at graphs relating, for instance, CO2 output per person, emissions per person, and life expectancy, you see that fairly early in the transition from the sort of middle income countries to the rich countries, the curve of life expectancy that rises with GNP per capita, it starts to level off. And so we have huge increases as countries get richer in emissions, without any improvement in measures of well-being, in measures of happiness, in measures of life expectancy and health. So actually, to live at a lower standard of living, we are not making genuine sacrifices of the quality of our lives. What drives our desire for more all the time is what I tried to talk about in terms of our worries about what other people think of us, our status anxieties that drive consumerism. You know, the people who get into debt, who spend most, who are most addicted to shopping and so on, are people who are most insecure about their status, psychologically insecure, more likely to be depressives and so on. We have to understand what is driving our consumerism and high levels of consumption, and understand that it doesn't actually, in the rich countries, bring increased rewards in terms of the real quality of our lives.
Chuka, Maya, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I can go quickly. I mean, I would say that it's incorrect to say that Canada doesn't have an impact on global emissions. The Canadian mining industry is very active around the world and has done some incredibly horrible things, including ecological destruction, participating in the repression of social movements. Very quickly, in regard to the last question, you know, violently repressive authoritarian governments have been brought down by grassroots revolutions. So it is possible. It's just not always possible without some kind of conflict. But yeah, so anyway, returning to this issue, it's also the case that Canada supports the United States, supports Saudi Arabia, supports Israel, other countries that not only systematically violate human rights, but also are very much invested in the global economic system and maintaining the sort of existing power relationships between countries, to the point that the US is increasingly engaging in brinksmanship toward China, again, with the help of Canada, because it's sort of contesting for the position of global power, completely disregarding any concern for any kind of well-being related to the pandemic or global climate change or inequality or anything else. And then finally, the last thing I would say is that Richard, you talked about speaking about the truth, and you also mentioned that the majority of people who are dying or suffering related to climate change or disasters spurred by climate change are in the poorest countries in the world. And that, I mean, you know, if we're going to talk about equity, we have to talk about equitable distributions of death and suffering, which is not something that we ever discuss, but that is perhaps one of the most egregious things about this world, that where you were born, the sort of pure accident of your birth will determine in many cases your life expectancy, your access to well-being, things like that. So I don't think it's defensible to say that simply because I was born in Canada, I deserve to live while others die. And if people do believe that, I mean, I would contest that belief and argue against it with them. But there will be people who knowingly ascribe to that belief, and I think those people are just the political opposition. Like, those are the people that you have to defeat. I don't pretend to think that every single person in the world is going to want the best for every single other person in the world. I just think you got to beat the people who don't.
Okay, Maya.
Yeah, thank you. You know, my response briefly is that it's also a question of scale, and again of focus. When we only look at the scales beyond our spheres of influence, then we really can do nothing but wring our hands. So I think it's very important to be informed, to be grounded in truth, but then to look at where change is happening. And that is often in people's communities, in their own lives. And I think when we look at climate action, climate resilience, it's happening at that scale. And I think if we need to elevate into our consciousness and our conversations, our media and so on, these other kinds of scales and scopes of action. And I think part of that too is that there are a lot of good news stories. There are a lot of people who have lost, who live, these inequitable lives, and we are still here, and people are still resilient, and they're finding incredible ways to live lives the best we can. And we have to tell those stories too. And I know that in the work I've done around climate change in the provincial north and so on, people are willing to make changes, but we haven't listened to how they're willing to make changes. It's not only just about just transitions, but it's also about needing to have accessibility to making the kinds of choices that enable sustainability to happen in our particular and geographically situated place-based contexts and so on. So there are a lot of good news stories, and incredible forms of resilience happening, and we're not talking about it. And so then we do not have a counter narrative, and we do not know where to look. And we need to look to the, to people who are doing the work and amplify that, as well as amplifying the problems.
Okay, we only have about 3 minutes left. I cannot believe how quickly this has gone by. So I want to ask you about this, because some might say that this could be the equivalent of Mohamed Bouazizi, who is the Tunisian who you referred to earlier, Rich Wilkinson, as the man who set himself on fire and apparently caused the Arab Spring to happen. Someone asking if you can share your opinions of Extinction Rebellion, which I believe started in the UK.
Yes, I think we have to join whatever movement we feel most hopeful about. This is the time to be joining movements. Extinction Rebellion is an extremely important one. It has made people much more aware of the issues, a big increase in public awareness, just as Black Lives Matter led to a big change in the attitudes of American whites and understanding of racism. Opinion polls showed big shifts in opinions. And before that, the Occupy movement, making people aware of inequality. Suddenly, there was much, much more media attention, and it's been maintained. There are papers that show actually that big demonstrations are effective in changing opinion. We have to get involved. We have to join movements. I'm not going to say which I think are the best, but there's no doubt at all that demonstrating, turning out on the street and so on is absolutely required now of all of us. Greta Thunberg talks about the need for leadership. I don't know whether leaders can do it on their own. There's complete lack of any inspiring leadership at the moment. I don't know whether someone could focus opinion and a movement that would really get things done. But there is certainly a need for a quality of leadership that is simply missing at the moment. I do think that our primary task, and I have starting to become active just in our village, talking about heat pumps and so on, and electric bikes, and we have a village WhatsApp, and I put on how much carbon one tank full of petrol uses for my car, although it's a Prius, and so it's slightly less. But of course, those standards of living and that idea of how we could go on into the future is unrealistic. But we have to do things to spread these ideas to all the people around us who are suffering from this myopia, this false optimism. We have to get rid of that and build the movements.
All right, on that note, we have to wrap things up. Thank you to Richard, Chuka, and Maya for a really powerful conversation. And thank you to all who could join us today on this SFU Vancouver Speaker Series event. Now over to Laurie Anderson for his closing remarks.
Thank you, Professor Wilkinson, for your very thought-provoking lecture. Thank you also to Chuka and Maya for your insightful responses. And also to you, Laura, for your excellent moderation once again. Thank you also to Elder Dennis Joseph Kiewicz Tall, who got us started in the right way. And I'd also like to thank our colleagues and friends at SFU Public Square and SFU's Van City Office of Community Engagement, and to our interpreters and our captioners for this event. Thank you to all of us who joined us today, and I wish you well. Thank you for being here.